The following is a presentation of VBR. Welcome, and thank you for joining us in our study of God's holy word.
This is number 79 in the sequence of the video Bible reading of the book of Acts, picking up in Acts chapter 27 and verse 33. Paul and his companions, along with Roman soldiers who were accompanying him, and a number of sailors and others, were on board a ship that was bound for Rome. However, they encountered bad weather, and they were forced off course and down to the island of Crete. After a stop in a harbor that was not altogether desirable, they decided to go on further, although Paul strongly advised them, just plain warned them, it won't turn out well if you do this, strongly advised them to remain at Fairhaven on Crete and not to try and go on to the next harbor down the coast. But they were determined for various reasons, most of them selfish in a sense, materialistic reasons, but they were determined to defy the odds and continue on, and so they did, and they never reached that harbor at Phoenix, being overtaken by a kind of cyclonic storm that occurs on the Mediterranean Sea. And so they're caught up in this typhoon, and they're driven south for some distance, and in the course of that, they threw overboard the cargo, they threw overboard the gear, they bound the ship with ropes. Ultimately, they had to cut loose the lifeboat at the final stage of the journey as they're approaching land after 2 weeks. And that's where we pick up the story, is in Acts 27 and 33. And Luke has related the story to us in such a way that we can appreciate that it is a story of the providence of God. And Paul highlights that in his discussions, his dialogues with the crew and the centurion and others, that God's hand is in this, that God is in control. Does it look like God's in control? Well, certainly it doesn't look like any of their gods are in control, but Paul says, God has a purpose in this. God wants me to go to Rome, and God is going to save everyone's life. We're all going to survive because of God's grace and promise that He's given to me. And so we pick up in Acts 27, where they are anchored offshore of an island. They don't know what island it is, what land it is yet at this point in the story, but they are anchored offshore in the night, waiting for daybreak to see what lies ahead. Acts 27:33. As day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. Therefore I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength, for not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you." And when he had said these things, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Then they all were encouraged and ate some food themselves. We were in all 276 persons in the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. So they've been through a long night, a night in which the sailors attempted to escape the ship on their own in the lifeboat, and the soldiers prevented that from happening. It'd been a long night, waiting for daybreak. And as soon as the day began to dawn, Paul again stepped up and took the lead, encouraging and urging all the people on that ship, 276 people in all, encouraging all of them to take heart, to not be afraid, to eat some food, to get themselves ready for the circumstances that were about to transpire. 2 weeks they'd been in distress and uncertain of survival, and at least a significant number of them, the sailors and others, had been going without food during that entire time. So Paul's assurance now, he told them they would make it through the night. They have made it through the night. And they've gotten past the betrayal of the sailors, and his assurance is not a hair of your head will perish. So there's not even going to be significant injury in this process. As bad as the odds look from a human standpoint, by God's grace, not a hair of your head will be destroyed. You're all going to come through this just fine. Everyone's going to make it to shore. It's all good. Eat some food and be strong. Not exactly what Joshua was counseled to do before leading Israel across the Jordan, when he was told to be of good courage. Do not fear, be of good courage, be strong and courageous. But that kind of encouragement is what Paul is delivering here to all of these men and passengers of pagan background. Not exactly what Joshua was counseled to do before crossing the Jordan, but still consistent with human nature and with divine providence. God is there for people who trust in Him. Paul said it, eat some food, And then he did it in front of all of them. Like Jesus before the hungry multitude, he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it. And Luke reports that in the feeding of the 5,000. Luke reports that in the Last Supper and some other occasions, that Jesus took bread, blessed it, and broke it. When Jesus was on the road to Emmaus with the disciples after his resurrection, and they came to their destination, and he sat down to eat with them, and he took bread and gave thanks and broke it, and they recognized who he was. And I think that this language it's common language, and yet the way Luke says it reminds me of what Jesus did on those various occasions. And Paul here is the servant, the ambassador, the representative of Jesus, and he took bread and gave thanks, and he broke it in front of all those people, and then he began to eat. And do take note, he gave thanks in front of them all. And I mention this in terms of our own modern practices. When you're eating out at a restaurant, do you take the time and willingly make a demonstration of your faith in God by giving thanks in front of them all? It's entirely appropriate to do that. It's consistent with what Paul did here. It's consistent with what the Lord did over and over again. That in public places, he gave thanks for his food before he broke it and ate it or shared it. Paul did that here. He gave thanks for his food in a public way that people could see that he was a man of faith, that he trusted in God, that he was grateful to God. He gave thanks in those circumstances on a ship that is anchored off the shore of an unknown land after 14 days being storm-tossed. He gave thanks. Be thankful in all circumstances, is what Paul wrote in the Thessalonian letter. In everything, give thanks, in the 5th chapter there of 1 Thessalonians. So don't hesitate to give thanks in public settings, in restaurants or other places. And I'm not saying to be rude and intrude on people, but don't hesitate to take a moment with your family or friends or by yourself and give thanks in places where people can observe your thankfulness and be aware that you give glory to God. This was a testimony of faith on Paul's part and an encouragement to the ship's company. And it says they were all encouraged, and that was one of Paul's goals on that early morning, for them to be encouraged and to know that they could count on God. They could trust God. They all did as Paul did, taking some food, following his example. They were encouraged. Luke here tells us that the ship's passengers and crew, I mentioned the number a moment ago, amounted to 276 people. That was a lot of people on that ship. And these people, Paul says, the Lord's angel, God's angel, had said to him, God is giving you their lives. They owed their lives to Paul. They owed their lives to Paul's God. And Paul wanted them to know that. They owed their lives to Paul's God, who was acting in grace toward Paul and mercy toward all those who accompanied him. After that final common meal on the ship, the rest of the wheat was thrown overboard to lighten the ship still more, so it would ride higher and less likelihood of hitting rocks and wrecking on the way in toward shore, less of the hull under the water as they approached the unknown land, which proved to be an island. Chapter 27, verses 39 through 44 from the English Standard Version, Acts 27:39. Now when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach, on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. Then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. And he ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest on planks or on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. Daylight came, and they didn't know where they were, didn't recognize the shore, didn't know this coast. They saw a bay with a beach, and that looked like a good destination. Try and bring the ship into the bay, onto the beach. And they had little to work with. Their sails were pretty nearly gone, but they did still have the ability to raise a foresail here. They'd thrown most of the gear overboard almost 2 weeks earlier in the early days of the storm, but they still had rudders. And when I read the word rudders here, I picture the modern rudder with the steering arrangement and all that. And that's really not what we're talking about. It's more along the lines of an extended oar that could be dipped in the water and used for steering. But they still had rudders that had been out of the water and tied, and now they're lowered into the water for steering. And they still had a foresail, and so with those, they made a run for the beach, having some limited ability to steer and drive the ship. But there was an unseen reef, and the ship promptly ran aground on the reef some distance from shore, and once the bow has come to rigid immobility, the actions of the waves begin to break the ship apart, the rear of the ship apart very quickly. And Roman soldiers were merciless in such circumstances. If they failed to deliver a prisoner who was entrusted to them, they would suffer whatever fate the prisoner had been destined for. Remember how back in the 12th chapter of the book of Acts, Peter had been a prisoner, and there were 4 groups of 4 soldiers that were assigned to guard him. And the 4 soldiers who were on duty the night that the angel came and set Peter free from prison, they were examined, which means they were beaten, and then they were put to death because Peter had gotten away on their watch. And they had no idea how it had happened. No one had any idea how it had happened except those who heard Peter's account of the angel. But these soldiers were very aware of policy, that if they lost a prisoner, then they were held liable for fulfilling the penalty that prisoner would have been subjected to. And so they decided that they would kill all the prisoners. And that they could do. Under Roman law, they could do that. But the centurion was having none of it. Paul, explicitly, Luke says that Paul was favorable in the eyes of the centurion. Again, this reminds me, the providential stories of Joseph. Joseph found favor in the eyes of Potiphar, his master. And Joseph found favor in the eyes of the jailer when he was in jail. And Paul here found favor in the eyes of Julius the centurion, who was charged with transporting him to Rome. This is the providential hand of God, that others might be saved through the saving of Paul, as others were saved through the saving of Joseph. The threads that run through these stories are very similar, have a lot of aspects in common. So the soldiers didn't want to die, and they were going to kill the prisoners, but all the prisoners were saved because Julius was not about to see them kill Paul. And so he intervened in Paul's behalf and prevented the soldiers from carrying out the plan to kill the prisoners. The practical thing to do was kill the prisoners, but the right thing to do was to spare their lives. And the centurion here erred on the side of doing what's right because Paul had favor in his eyes. The centurion saved all the prisoners. So this is God's providence at work. The same providence we see over and over again in various Old Testament stories of God working through circumstances to bring about the results that he intended. By the grace of God, guiding the hands of a Roman centurion named Julius, the whole ship's company, 276 souls, survived the wreck of the ship from Alexandria, so that Paul could stand before Nero in Rome, according to God's purpose. Julius did what was right, and because Julius did what was right, as Paul led him to do, because Julius did what was right, the people survived. How did Julius know what to do? Because God guided Paul to give him instructions to know what to do, to fulfill God's purposes. The story of the ill-fated voyage from Crete to Malta recounts no obvious miracles. Paul didn't suddenly calm the storm. The Lord didn't lead Paul to take actions of that nature whatsoever. No obvious miracles, other than the vision in the night that Paul alone saw and related to the other people on the ship. But this story demonstrates the hand of God in action for his people and the way people in the world sometimes are blessed as a result of God's care for his people. When God blesses his people, the people around them are blessed in turn. We are the salt of the earth. It's a story of man's helplessness and certain doom, and of God's mercy and grace working through the faith and obedience of one man. A story that is, in physical terms, much like the gospel in spiritual terms. In Acts chapter 28, the story continues now. They have come ashore, some of them using planks or floating debris from the wreck. They have all come ashore. And when they landed, they found that the island they were on is called Melita to the Greeks and Romans, Malta in modern terms. They've come to the island of Malta. The native people, Paul says, showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and welcomed us all, because it had begun to rain and was cold. When Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and put them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened on his hand. When the native people saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "No doubt this man is a murderer. Though he escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." He, however, shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. They were waiting for him to swell up and suddenly fall down dead, but when they had waited a long time and saw no misfortune come to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god. Shipwrecked on the island of Malta, about 600 miles from Crete. They'd been driven more than, because they didn't follow a straight line, but they'd been driven 600 miles in the 14 days they spent in this awesome storm on the Mediterranean, and arrived now on this island of Malta, a small island that was south of the island of Sicily and a part of the Roman province of Sicily. The native people that Luke refers to here, Luke uses the word barbarians, and to us that word has a negative connotation. But Luke uses the word barbarians. That's how Greeks describe people who spoke other language. They sounded like bar, and that's where the word barbarian comes from in Greek. These were not Greek-speaking people. They weren't Latin-speaking people. They were people who spoke a dialect of the ancient Phoenician language, as a matter of fact. These people were the descendants of the ancient Phoenician peoples who had inhabited a good part of the Mediterranean in the distant past. And they were thoroughly connected to the Roman world. The Roman government is there on the island of Malta, Melita. But it's not a Latin-speaking community. It's not a Greek-speaking community. It is a foreign-speaking community, a group of barbarians in the strictest meaning of that term, the typical use of that term in the Greek language. What Luke noted as a survivor of the shipwreck was the kindness and the hospitality of the locals for strangers who had crashed on their shore. And they were pagans. They certainly were not Christians. There was, as far as we would know, no Jewish population there. This was a population of pagans with a pagan heritage going back for millennia. But they showed hospitality and kindness to the strangers who came to their shore. They didn't try to take advantage of them or rob them, as sometimes happened with castaways. They welcomed them and made them comfortable as much as they could in the immediate circumstances. The fierce storm that had carried the ship and its personnel was substantially over, but there was, nevertheless, rain and chill breeze and so forth. It was cold, it was wet. And the season by this time, we're into late October or early November from the time they spent at sea and the various circumstances that had taken place. So we're into late October, early November, chilly time in the fall of the year here. And so Paul, the apostle, didn't sit on his laurels, didn't consider himself above doing menial labor. Paul was gathering sticks to add to the fire. And he's just another shipwrecked survivor doing his part at the moment, pitching in to do what he can. And a somnolent viper, a viper that had been probably not active because of the chill in the air, was either close to the fire and warmed by the heat of the flames, or was in some of the wood that was brought to the fire, and the fire caused it to respond. But at any rate, a viper warmed by the fire struck Paul as he's adding wood to the fire and got a hold of his hand. And the locals saw that, the viper that was dangling from Paul's hand. And no doubt, they'd already been informed by the soldiers that some of these castaways, they needed to know that some of these castaways were prisoners bound for trial in Rome, and Paul was one of those. So putting the pieces together, they surmised that Paul must be a murderer or some kind of a terrible criminal who deserved to die. And the term they used here, it's the word justice, but it's also the name of a pagan goddess. Justice was a pagan goddess. In fact, we see her symbol on our courts and so forth with the blindfold and the scale. But justice, they're talking about a goddess here. Justice determined that he should die, even though he escaped the shipwreck and his life was spared to come to shore. So while Paul had obviously escaped with his life, they assumed this is karma, this is cosmic justice being administered here from the goddess of justice, and that Paul was die. They're going to watch him die horribly as he swells from the venom and falls over dead. Now, Luke's account of Paul's reaction, that he shook off the viper into the fire, seems kind of understated. It's as though he just, oh well, and shook it off. He didn't panic. He didn't make a scene. He didn't consult with his physician friend, what do I do now? He kept his calm. Hadn't the Lord told him in Jerusalem that he was going to Rome? Indeed he had. Hadn't the Lord assured him while he was in Caesarea that he would go and speak to Caesar? Indeed he had. Hadn't God sent an angel the day before, the night of the day before, to encourage him with the assurance that all would survive and that he himself would go to Rome? Indeed he had. Consequently, Paul, a man of faith, didn't lose his composure over a snake bite. No doubt he was familiar with Jesus' assurance to his disciples in Mark chapter 16, where Mark gives a description of the Great Commission, Mark 16:16 through 18. Jesus said, "Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned. And these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name they will cast out demons, they will speak in new tongues, they will pick up serpents with their hands, and if they drink any deadly poison, it will not hurt them. They will lay their hands on the sick and they will recover." And Mark goes on to say in the next couple of verses that all of that did in fact happen. They did go out preaching and the signs did accompany them. But one of those signs there in verse 18, they will pick up serpents with their hands. Now, nowhere in the New Testament is there a description of any of the Lord's representatives looking for a chance to handle a poisonous snake. They didn't go looking for that, but there may have been other occasions besides Paul's experience here where one way or another they were subjected to snake bite. And in those cases, they were to hold their faith firm. And at least sometimes the Lord must have done as he said he would. They will handle serpents with their hands. Here Paul handled a serpent, threw it into the fire. But here Paul handled a serpent. It latched onto his hand and he had no ill consequences from that. And surely what Mark wrote, Paul already knew. Paul was surely aware of this promise of Jesus, that this was just one more thing he didn't need to fret about. He had been beaten. He had been shipwrecked. He had been stoned. He had been through innumerable hardships, and he didn't lose his head over a snake bite. He handled it very calmly. To the islanders' surprise, Paul did not swell up and die. And incidentally, the word for swelling that Luke uses here is a medical term, a Greek medical term, which is appropriate. Luke is the only one who uses this word in the New Testament, and Luke is the beloved physician, as Paul describes him over in Colossians. But Luke, the physician, used the medical term that describes the inflammation that would come from a snake bite. Now, when the islanders saw that Paul had been struck by a snake, but had not been struck down by the goddess Justice, in fact, he hadn't even been harmed by the poisonous snake at all. He had shaken it off and gone on with business as usual. Now they jumped to an entirely different conclusion. Rather than a guilty murderer, they concluded, as 15 years earlier the people of Lystra had concluded after Paul, in the name of Jesus, healed a lame man, Acts 14:11, they concluded that Paul was himself a god. On that occasion, they concluded that he was Hermes, the messenger god. On this occasion, it doesn't say, but they concluded that he was a god. Luke is not denigrating those folks and saying, they're very superstitious with their assumptions. Rather, he's reminding us of what human nature is, of how fickle people are, how quickly they go from positive to negative or negative to positive, and how quickly people act on the basis of assumptions. People all around us jump to conclusions in similar ways all the time with very little grounding in truth or evidence. We need to be different than that. We need to be wiser than that and have a better foundation for the conclusions that we draw. Paul was not a pagan deity, but he had not yet had a chance to preach Christ to these folks on the island of Malta. I've no doubt he did during the days that he spent there. Acts 28, verses 7 through 10. Acts 28, verses 7 through 10, reading from the ESV. Now, in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the chief man of the island named Publius, who received us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days. It happened that the father of Publius lay sick with fever and dysentery. And Paul visited him and prayed, and putting his hands on him, healed him. And when this had taken place, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases also came and were cured. They also honored us greatly, and when we were about to sail, they put on board whatever was needed. Publius is a Roman name, even though the people on this island are speakers of a Phoenician dialect. Publius is a Roman name, and he was the first man of Malta, the chief man of Malta, the man who had the most authority with Roman governance in that province. The Greek word that Luke used here, which is rendered great man or chief man in the ESV, the chief man, the word that Luke used here is a technical term for the man who was the leading authority on the island of Malta. It's exactly the right word for the particular government they had there within the framework of the Roman Empire. Luke has used technical language over and over again, exactly the right word in the right place, describing everything he has depicted in accurate historical and geographical detail. The word that's used here is not a common word for a civic leader. It's not a word that's apropos in other places, but it's the right word for Malta, where Luke was when this took place. Over and over again in Acts, Luke has used exactly the right titles for the leaders in the various cities that he's talked about in various areas. Several times they've been unusual and obscure titles that demonstrate his accuracy and his truthfulness. And I'm not going to run through that litany of titles at the moment, but we have examples in Acts 13 and 7, Acts 16:20, Acts 17:6, Acts 19:31, and here in Acts 28:7 of Luke using the exact, distinct, unique title that applied to the location and the circumstances that he's referring to. He always got it right. And as F.F. Bruce has observed, if a man gets things right in the small details, it indicates you can trust him in the larger matters. Now, that leading man, Publius, that's mentioned to us here, he showed at least Paul's group hospitality for 3 days. I'm not sure if the whole troop of 276 survivors were his guests, but at least Paul's group, which would include his fellow travelers, Luke and Aristarchus, maybe others, and the Roman soldiers, at least that many of them were, and it includes us, Luke uses the plural pronoun including himself, including Luke, were shown hospitality by this man. And his kindness, the kindness of Publius, was rewarded when Paul prayed and healed his father. This played out very much like Jesus in Capernaum. If we go back to Luke chapter 4, verses 38 through 41, when Jesus was in Capernaum and he healed a man, and then he went to Peter's house and he healed Peter's mother-in-law. And that night, all the people of Capernaum who were sick or had sick people came and gathered at Peter's door so that Jesus would heal them. And the same thing played out here on Malta in this island, is that after Paul healed through the power of God, he prayed and asked for healing. After Paul healed this man, the whole group of people from the community came and were gathered there at the home of Publius so that Paul might perhaps heal them as well. And we don't know from Luke's account whether a church was begun on Malta in the 3 months they spent on the island. He doesn't specifically say so. But we do know that Paul and his company made a very good impression on the natives, who sent them away with blessings and supplied all their needs. And I would not doubt that, in fact, they left believers behind when they left Malta after 3 months. And that's where we'll pick up next time. In Acts chapter 28 and verse 11 is that after 3 months on Malta, they finally sail away and in the late winter, early spring, go toward Rome once again. So we'll pause there. And we are reminded here again of God's grace and mercy toward his people. God had a purpose for Paul, and he did miraculous things, but most of the things he did in the course of this story were God's providence, God taking care of them through difficulties, through storm and wind, through the threats of various people and so forth, God taking care of them through circumstances. And God does that still for his people. We too, should have confidence that God will bring us to the conclusion that he desires for our lives if we trust in him. And we ought to trust in him.